seems like you've taken on this dragon voluntarily. It seems like from the beginning you've known that this, for example, when you spoke up against Bill C-16 in Canada, you knew that this might become tough.
Well, like I'd taught people to negotiate in my clinical practice for a long time. You know, I've had lots of clients. Many of those clients were female, and the goal in my consulting with them was to double or triple their salary within 5 years. And so that wasn't necessarily the only goal. We discussed all sorts of goals, but that was often one. And so I was very accustomed to organizing people to negotiate. And if you want to negotiate, there's a couple of rules. The first rule is you have to be able to say no. And what no means is there isn't anything you can do to me to get me to do that. That's what no means. Now, like you can have different degrees of seriousness about no, but if you're going to negotiate with your boss, say, for a substantial raise, no means if I don't get it, then I will leave. That's fundamentally, and that leaving will cost you more than, it's not a threat, right? It has to be the observation that me leaving will cost you substantially more than giving me the raise. You have to be in a position to make that case or you don't win the negotiation. And so I always put my clients in a position where if they went and asked for something, they were in a position to win because we didn't go and ask before that. So when I made the video criticizing Bill C-16, I thought, I'm not abiding by this damn piece of legislation. And then I thought, well, what does it mean that I'm not? And I thought, well, I had multiple sources of income, so I was reasonably positioned to tolerate a fair bit of pushback. I mean, I could have got wiped out had things gone sideways, but it would have been difficult to take me out completely. And I thought, there's no way I'm abiding by this piece of legislation. I thought through the negative consequences. Now, I didn't, of course, think that any of this would happen because this is just completely preposterous and no one could have possibly foreseen it. But so I would say there were certain things I faced in doing that, but I couldn't have foreseen the absolutely explosive consequences. I'm not unhappy that I did it. I would do it again. I am still doing it, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So,
which of your 12 rules do you break most often?
I could probably still be better at listening to people. I do interviews with people. I call them discussions because they're not really interviews. Probably they're not interviews because I talk too much. So I had to call them discussions. But I would say the most common criticism of those discussions is that I interrupt the people that I'm discussing things with and tilt the conversation probably a little bit more towards me, my thinking than theirs. Now, part of that I think is my natural tendency towards, like I've always talked a lot ever since I was like 3, like continually. So I'm verbally fluent, you know, it's part of my nature and extroverted. But you can always get better at listening, you know, and so I can listen, and I practice that because I'm a therapist, but I would say that's probably the rule I break. That's rule 9, like assume that the person you're listening to knows something you don't. It's like, I'm not as good at that yet as I could be because I wouldn't get that criticism if I was. Like, it's not every comment or anything, it's probably like every 20th comment or every 30th comment, but it's still consistent, and so every time I have an interview I think, okay, I'm going to try to shut up a little bit more. But then I get excited about what's happening and, you know, and talk too much.
One thing related to that, sometimes you seem to go off on a tangent when you're discussing something. You go into something related to it, and then you come back to a greater structure of things. Have you laid all this out before you say it, or do you just go from one topic to another and they somehow relate together and become whole.
Both.
Yeah.
But so before I do a talk, like I have to, I think about the talk all day before I do it. Like not 100% of the time, but it's in my mind all the time. And what I'm trying to get is the basic narrative. And it's something like, I can only use a metaphor to really describe it. So imagine you wanted to cross a swamp and there were stones under the surface. You need to know where the stones are to get from one side of the swamp to the other. And so then that's what I do in my imagination. I think, okay, well there's this area I have to traverse and there's stepping stones along the way. I need to know where they're located. And so that might be like 12 points or something like that. That's the rough path. And then I have a whole corpus of stories that fit each of those points, and then I can choose how I'm going to weave those together. But I have to remember where I'm going. And if I'm well, like if I'm healthy and functioning properly, then I can go way out on a tangent, and I can still remember, oh yes, I have to tie that back to this point and move to the next step. So it's, I think it's like jazz improvisation, essentially. You know, you have the melody, and it has to organize, the melody has to organize all the improvisation. And then I have all these stories that I know, but every time I tell the story, I try to vary it so that it brings in something I haven't brought in before, integrates something. You know, like one of the things I was trying to do tonight, I've been trying to figure out for a long time, is how to integrate the idea of the good player of games with the idea of voluntarily shouldering the catastrophe of life. I know those are the same thing, but it's not obvious why. And it's still not completely obvious to me, but I know that the connection exists. And I got a fair ways tonight, farther than I had it, stacking those concepts on top of each other. So the other thing I'm always trying to do is to take each of these sets of ideas and to weave them together more tightly, but also to push them further in their development. So,
And you've been doing that on this tour? Have you been developing your ideas?
oh, absolutely, absolutely. You can't give an effective lecture without, so you don't deliver a talk to an audience. First of all, it's not a talk. Second, you don't deliver it. Third, it isn't an audience. Like, all of that's wrong. You talk to individuals in the audience, one at a time, and they're representative of the whole, but you're not talking to the audience. If you're afraid of public speaking, it's because you're talking to the audience. It's like, forget about that. You just talk to people. You know how to do that. And then, you're not delivering a talk, because then it's a canned product. You might as well just hand people pieces of paper that they could read. It's more efficient. Why not do that? What you're doing, if you address people properly, is that you involve them in the process of furthering exploration of important concepts. And you think, well, how can you do that? Because they're sitting there passively. It's like, well, you're not passive. You're not verbal, but you're not passive. Like, I listen to whether or not everyone's rustling around. If you're rustling around, then I'm not balancing chaos and order properly. You're not gripped. If I can hear noise in the audience, it's not right. I watch people one by one, and I see sometimes they're shaking their head like this, sometimes they're nodding, sometimes they look confused. If people look confused, I think, well, I haven't got that right. I have to be watching people and seeing that they're understanding, they're following along. And that indication that they're following along helps me figure out if I'm in the right place. And so there's a dynamic that goes along with it. And so all of that, and that's what you're doing if you engage the audience properly, is you shouldn't be talking about things you don't know enough about to talk about. So if you have to read your notes, it's like, sorry, you don't know enough to talk about that, because you need notes. Now, maybe when you're first starting to talk about something, you need notes, but if you need notes, you haven't prepared enough. You should know like 10 times as much about the topic than you're going to talk about in the talk. Otherwise, who the hell are you? And so, well, right, I mean, you're supposed to be the authority, so you need to know these things. And so, and then knowing these things, you want to stretch them further. Because when you're this is a theater, a lecture theater. Theater is drama. So why is it a lecture theater? Because lecture is drama. What's the drama? Delivering a talk. No. There's no drama in that. A tape recorder can do that. The drama is to engage with the ideas actively in real time and to discover with the audience what the consequence is. And that's what makes a novel great, for example. The reason a Dostoevsky novel is great is because Dostoevsky did not know where he was going when he started. He had problems, you know, like Crime and Punishment is a great example. He wanted to explore the relationship between crime and punishment. He didn't think, well, I'm a postmodern neo-Marxist and I have a solution to the problem of crime and punishment, and I'm going to write a novel describing what the right solution is. He thought, here's a problem, man, this is a major problem. I'm going to divide myself into 10 characters, and I'm going to have a war, and I'm going to see what prevails. And he takes you along on that voyage, and that's what makes Dostoevsky different than Ayn Rand, for example. Because Ayn Rand already knew who the good guys and the bad guys were. And maybe she was right, and maybe she wasn't. Doesn't matter. What matters is that what she did wasn't literature. It was just sophisticated propaganda. You know, like it taps into literature upon occasion, but she knew where she was going, whereas Dostoevsky, he discovered it along the way. And so he takes you along on the journey, and that's, any great artist does that, takes you along on the journey. That's why it's so revivifying to encounter anything that's genuinely artistic, is because you're along for the conflict between chaos and order. And that's way more interesting than having a talk delivered to you